Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome all of you to this panel discussion, Let's Talk Policy, part of a series at the Kautilya School of Public Policy. I'm Nidhi Razdan, and we're very privileged to have with us three distinguished doctors who are joining us to talk about the one issue that is affecting all of us here in India today. It's affecting the whole world, but particularly affecting India at the moment, and that is the pandemic, that is COVID-19. Let me please first welcome Dr. Shahid Jamil, who is the director of the Trivedi School of Biosciences at Ashoka University. He has been working in molecular virology from the University of Colorado Medical School in the US. He was also the group leader of virology at the International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology in India for over 25 years. So he has a great deal of experience in this field. We have Dr. Romil Tikku, Director of Internal Medicine at Max Healthcare, who has been treating COVID patients now for more than a year. And I think we'd really like to hear from him in terms of what doctors are looking at clinically, what they're seeing, and how that matches up anecdotally. For more than 22 years, Dr. Tikku has worked with different leading hospitals from Gangaram to Apollo to Rama Manohar Loya. And he has also worked on particularly the H1N1 virus, the spread of swine flu, as a medical expert, part of a panel set up by the Union Health Ministry back in 2009 to look at that particular viral spread. And Dr. U.S. Vishal Rao is the Dean of Healthcare Global Cancer Center in Bangalore. He's a TEDx speaker, and he's also the inventor of the Om Voice prosthesis, which is a $1 speaking device for throat cancer patients, which is really quite incredible. He's also been a visiting faculty to the Johns Hopkins University leadership programs. Thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. And before we begin, I just want to put this out there that all of us have in the last few weeks had so much bad news. We wake up to the news that we have lost friends, colleagues, other loved ones. And unfortunately, at Geetham University as well, we have lost a number of colleagues in the last few weeks. And we would just like to begin this session with a moment of silence just to pay our respects to them and all those who've lost their lives in this pandemic. All right. Thank you very much once again to all of you. And let me begin straight away with Dr. Jamil first. And the question everyone really wants to know, Dr. Jamil, is when is this wave going to peak? And is it going to get worse before it gets better?
Okay. So Nidhi, that is the realm of modelers, people who do epidemiological modeling. I'm not one of those, but I can cite at least three models that are doing the rounds. The first model is something that's called the University of Michigan model, which is done by an Indian COVID uh, group. Uh, that predicts that the uh, outbreak is good. This wave is going to peak out sometime in the second week of May. Uh, and the numbers at peak are likely to be in the range of about 8 to 10 lakhs per day. That's about twice the number that we're seeing today. The second model is a model that my colleague at Ashoka University, Gautam Menon, has built along with some people at the Institute for Mathematical Sciences in Chennai. That model has a wider uncertainty window in terms of when the peak will come. So according to them, the peak would be sometime between the first and the third week of May. And the numbers at peak are going to be in the range of about 5 to 6 lakhs. The third model, which the government of India prefers to look at, is something called the super model, which is made by people at IIT Hyderabad, and IIT Kanpur. That model, according to that model, we should be peaking tomorrow at about 4 lakh cases. And according to the supermodel, after the peak, we will go down very rapidly over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Whereas the other two models say that the downward slope is going to be slow and painful uh, and will last some time till about June or July. So it's hard to say which one will work out. The thing about peaks is that you only know a peak when you are past it. And as a biologist, as a life scientist, my view on models is that all models are wrong, but some models are useful because every model is dependent upon the data that goes into building a model and the assumptions that you use to make a model. So keep that in mind and keep your fingers crossed that the damage is going to be minimal and we will get over this quickly.
Dr. Tikku, why has this particular wave been so bad and so ferocious? We're still trying to understand that. I see that the government has talked about a new mutant strain as partly being responsible for that. You've been looking at COVID patients and treating them now, including in the first wave and this wave. What is it that you noticed that was different? And what do you attribute to the ferocity of this wave?
Well, I think multiple factors are responsible for that, apart from the fact that we got complacent and we thought that we've dealt with it, it's dead and gone. All of us, it's not only you. We can't just blame the government, it's the people, the scientific community, everyone thought that we've dealt with it, India has faced it well. There were premature celebrations happening. And then the vaccine came and we thought, now we have the vaccine instead of one, we have two vaccines, and now it's not going to do anything to us. So there were so many factors which were responsible. Apart from that, also these mutant strains, we haven't done enough genomic sequencing. We've failed there. So we were not very proactive. When we saw this mutant strain in UK, we should have done something about it. We didn't do, we slept over it and it led to a spike. And we saw what it did in UK, in US. I mean, if they can get overwhelmed, what can happen to India? US is the richest country in the world. If they can struggle, India has to struggle. The kind of population we have, the healthcare resources we have, economic resources, and it had to happen. And these mutant strains clinically are very different. It's very, very contagious, I would say. And it's, according to me, it's virulent too. In the earlier phase, in the first wave, we saw patients, majority of them had mild disease or they were asymptomatic. But now also the majority are still having mild disease or they are asymptomatic, but young people, we're seeing increasing number of young people getting infected, children getting infected, though children still have mild disease, but a lot of young people who had a severe disease and it hits them hard in the first few days only now. Earlier, it would be like a flu-like illness in the first 5-7 days, and then it might progress. And you do your blood test, your inflammatory markers, and then you get in touch with your doctors, do a scan. It's not giving you that much time now. And there's a lot of discrepancy between inflammatory markers and the clinical picture now. If your CRP is high, you do a scan and you see the scan is absolutely normal. You don't do anything because the patient is clinically fine and the CRP gets better in the next few days. And where you think that the patient has a bad pneumonia, doesn't turn out to be like that. And certain patients don't have those many symptoms, but you do a CT scan and it's showing a moderate to severe pneumonia. A total discrepancy. I think it's the mutant strain which is at play, and we have been caught unawares. Though we still know a lot about the disease now, it's been more than 1.5 years. We have enough drugs at our disposal, but the healthcare system and the healthcare workers have been stretched and overwhelmed. I mean, the best of healthcare system cannot handle so many patients in a day, anywhere in the world. So that's why we've been overstretched. And now with the demand of beds and oxygen, I mean, people are dying because of lack of oxygen or lack of getting hospital beds. And that's very unfortunate. And what worse can happen? So that's where it's very, very depressing and frustrating for a healthcare worker like me. I mean, I've not been able to help a lot of people. A lot of patients call me, I don't take their call because I can't help them with oxygen. I can't help them with the beds. I can treat them. I can't manage all this. You need a team of people to do this. There has to be a central command which does this, handles beds, handles oxygen, drugs. I mean, there's black marketing happening, there's hoarding happening. People are not getting even basic drugs. Remdesivir is being sold left, right, and center in the black market for lakhs of rupees. Though it doesn't have much of a role, people don't know, they're not aware. Tocilizumab, something which sells for 50,000, 40,000, people are desperate. They're buying it for 3 lakhs, 4 lakhs. I mean, there's no regulation. It is very, very frustrating. I can tell you that.
I can actually hear the frustration in your voice, and we can see it on your face. And I know, Dr. Tikku, I'm so grateful that you've joined us today, because I know you are treating patients literally 24/7. I have been your patient, and you've been messaging at 4 in the mornings at times because you don't sleep. I mean, I don't know. My heart goes out to doctors like you and healthcare workers like you and the strain that you're under. And I want to thank all of you, really, honestly, from the bottom of our hearts, for everything that you're doing, all of you. Let me get to, because so many different issues both you and Dr. Jamil picked up. So I want to get to something that is a common question everyone is asking today, Dr. Rao, which is that how much are the vaccines actually helping us and protecting us against the disease? Because there is still a lot of vaccine hesitancy. You still see people being skeptical because they hear about people who had even 2 doses of the vaccine who are still getting COVID. So can you tell us how are both Covaxin and Covishield dealing with even this mutant strain? Are they good enough to deal with them?
I think, thank you, Nidhi. The fundamental fact that we all need to accept is that you either need to expose yourself to the vaccine or you need to expose yourself to the virus in the form of an infection. This is the only 2 options we have. Now, naturally, all of us would prefer to choose the vaccine. We all have had our debates. I remember as a part of the committee in Karnataka, in the initial first round, I myself gone through the same hesitancy. We asked for data. We wanted to all do a little bit more of evidence mining, but finally we came through it. We realized that at the end of it, we would prefer the vaccine than getting exposed to the infection. And today, thanks to that, we frontline workers are able to sit and work with some level of confidence. So one thing out there, which is very, very clear, is the final answer for this pandemic to save lives is going to be the vaccine. There's no second thought. There's no second discussion about it. So I think people have to overcome the hesitancy of the vaccination, because the second wave or the upcoming third wave is going to be much more devastating. Now, many people did see this coming. Many people did warn this. Epidemiologists, virologists did speak about this to say that, because last year, our experience was 100 years before. This year, we have a last year to talk about. And if you see the current vaccination protocols that we are having, we have less than 10% people who have taken the first dose and less than 5% who must have taken the second dose. So we've got a whole country ahead of us that needs still vaccination, and the production seems to be at a lag with the population. So whatever efforts we are going to do now for vaccination is going to be to protect ourselves from the third wave and mutants covered. And I think I completely agree with what Dr. Tikku brought out. Countries like UK, USA are talking about epidemiological genetic surveillance, and we are not even talking about it. To add to that, I always have been talking, it's not just about adding doctors. So if you tell Dr. Tikku, I'm giving you 10 more doctors, he doesn't need 10 more doctors. He needs trained people who's going to be sitting and working with him. It's not just about adding bulk to the whole discussion. So an important aspect of where we are going to be standing now is we are going to be ready for the third wave if we are well planned now. And I've been emphasizing this to our state government, discussing it on our forums to say that lockdown is a time for preparation. Lockdown is a time to slow down the virus while you are preparing. So if you are not well planned, do not do the lockdown. Do not waste your time doing lockdowns to just say that we are locking the down because we are treating the virus. You are not treating the virus by locking the entire economy down. So these are some of the problems that lie before us. And naturally, the coverage that we are going to get with the vaccine is the best currently. And what people need to understand is all of these vaccines have got authorization under emergency usage. And these vaccines do not reduce infection, they reduce the intensity of the disease and deaths. And that has been proven beyond doubt. So your mask is your third shot. Your mask is going to be your third shot. You have to continue to wear your mask after your first and second shot. So this is something that everybody needs to understand, that your vaccination is not the bullet, but you'll still have to wear your mask.
Now, that is important what you said. I want to ask Dr. Shahid Jamil a little bit more about this, that I think there's been this misconception or misinformation that if you get the vaccine, then you are bulletproof, you are protected, you can be maskless, you shouldn't be getting COVID at all. And however, that is not the case. If you could tell us, Dr. Jamil, I mean, how much does, say, the first dose of Covishield or Covaxin really protect somebody? Does this mean that most cases, even if you do get COVID, would be milder? Does the second dose offer more protection? Does that mean if you get the infection, it will be further milder? Does it rule out hospitalization, or does it just reduce the chance of hospitalization? What should we expect from these two vaccines in different stages?
Right. Nidhi, the questions you're asking are really post-vaccine rollout survey questions. And I don't believe in India we have done those well enough, at least not yet. In a phase 3 trial, when vaccines are tested against a placebo, that tells us whether, to what degree this vaccine would be protective. And this whole efficacy number is also a very highly misunderstood concept. Let's say there is a vaccine with 80% efficacy. It does not mean that if you give the vaccine to 100 people, 80 will be protected and 20 will be left unprotected. What it means is that all the people who take the vaccine will reduce their risk by 80%. Okay, so that's an important concept to understand. Now, so by taking the vaccine, you are essentially reducing your risk. Now, you will get infected if you're not careful, because all these vaccines have been tested, their efficacy has been given based on disease. So every vaccine is 100% protective against mortality. Every vaccine protects you against severe disease. Now, once the vaccine is rolled out in the population, we have to do these surveys to find out, let's say at Dr. Tiku's hospital, 100 healthcare workers took both doses of the vaccine. How many of them got infected? How many of those who got infected after the vaccine had severe disease? And we have had a chance to do at least some of this work with another hospital in Delhi. I cannot name the hospital. But in that hospital, there were 58 healthcare workers who came down with infection after both doses of vaccine. Out of those 58, only 5 were in the hospital, and only 1 was in the ICU. Okay, so, and even the person who was in the ICU was somebody who was 75 years of age. Okay. So, by all means, the vaccine did reduce the intensity of the disease. What we also found, and this is not published yet, we are still working on this, is that all of the people who got the infection had some kind of a mutant virus in them. Now, so what this really means is that new mutants are developing all the time in the population. And these mutants, to some extent, are able to evade vaccine-related immunity. But again, I will come back to say that I don't want to be alarmist and convey this impression that vaccines are not working. Vaccines are working. Vaccines are your best bet. So if you have a vaccine available to you, doesn't matter what it is, Covishield, Covaxin, go get it. Don't wait for a Pfizer to come to India or whatever. So just go get whatever vaccine is available, it will protect you. But don't expect the vaccine to protect you from infection. Continue to wear a mask, continue to protect yourself. That is how we are going to get over this.
Okay. Mr. Gurjeet Sekhon has a question, and we'll just get Mr. Gurjeet Sekhon on as a panelist to ask the question, but I have a lot of questions in the question and answer box as well. Saurav Haldar has an interesting question, saying that, we've been told to stay home and that, that way we will stay safe, but yet some people who never left their home for months also got infected. How do you explain that? Dr. Tiku, an example of that, which is my dad, who, has been housebound except for a couple of trips to the dentist. The last time he went out was to get his vaccine jab in early March. And he never went out after that, and he still got COVID. So I think a lot of people are asking that question, that ghar pe baith ke kaise hua?
Well, it's not supposed to happen like that, but there are a lot of people who've been infected sitting at home. Having said that, there must be some staff or somebody from home who goes out to get groceries, medicines, or whatever, or some packaging which comes from courier, or some stuff which comes home. Maybe some handling has happened. Maybe it has not been cleaned properly. And then you touch your face and you get it. I would think that is the most logical explanation for that. But otherwise, it doesn't happen like that. It's a droplet infection. Somebody who coughs and you're in the vicinity not wearing a mask, you will get it. Otherwise, it's a fomite infection. If you touch something which is infected and then you touch your face. But there are lots of cases where it's unexplained. Now, we don't really know what's happening in their house. Maybe somebody is not taking enough precautions. Maybe someone is not wearing the mask properly when somebody is out there in their house, giving them some package or something. So there are so many reasons, but primarily it doesn't happen like that. It is a droplet infection and happens only when you're exposed to an infectious patient.
Okay, Mr. Sekhon, are you there? You can please go ahead.
Yes, I am there. Good evening. I have two questions. The first one is for the two doctors here, which is, I've been listening to all these talks on the television. The message seems to be coming that no antiviral works. So are you recommending that patient should not get any antiviral? That is question number one. The second question, all the hospitals which are set up, is there mandated by the government that you need to have so much of oxygen storage tanks? And what is the percentage? Are they a little higher than what you really need? Though I understand that COVID, the oxygen requirement is far more, right? But these are the two questions I wanted to ask.
I'll let Dr. Rao take that question on the oxygen supplies to the hospitals before I come to the other one on antivirals. Dr. Rao?
Sure. So to answer this question on oxygen, currently, if you look at it on a regular day, non-COVID, if my hospital required 4 cylinders, I'm trying to simplify it, we calculate it in terms of cubic meters or in terms of pellet, but I'm just for the sake of understanding going to say we use 4 cylinders. When you are running a full COVID hospital, this requirement will be minimum twice or at least 3 times if you have ventilators. So just take a logical thing that if you're having a hospital without COVID, you are requiring 4 cylinders. If you're running a hospital which requires patients with oxygen, you will have double the requirement, and with ventilator, roughly 3 times the requirement. Now, I'm just giving you Karnataka's example. Karnataka required 1,500 metric ton of oxygen every day. And our the allotment given to us was 800. Now at this juncture, naturally, this is the simple ratio I'm talking about, that it is half. So we are running on reserve fuel. And this is the sense of worry and panic that each hospital is having, because today when I pick up the phone, I tell the oxygen supplier, usually every day he comes to my hospital, delivers the oxygen and goes. There was a day when he did not come. And that was the day I was waiting at the parking lot, wondering whether the truck is going to come or not. And he assured me it's on the way. And for me, that was not good enough, because we were running on reserve fuel. And if the truck does not come, what happens to the patients who are on the hospital? And this is the story of every hospital today. And in fact, I must tell you, the dichotomy is that there is a difference between state and cities which have oxygen supply, where the oxygen supply comes to the hospital, to difference in districts where the hospitals are running to oxygen suppliers with the empty cylinders. So this is the gap that we are facing in reality, and that's a very, very serious concern. And this has 2 aspects to it. One aspect is of oxygen, which has to be filled in by steel and other petroleum. For example, Karnataka is the largest manufacturer of liquid oxygen, but we still have a shortage. And the second is cryogenic tankers, which is used by industrial purposes, which is currently being used for multiple things, but needs to be consolidated only for oxygen. So these are 2 areas which at the policy level and at the level of hospitals, we need to conserve oxygen. We cannot be letting its leakages happen, and use it judiciously.
Dr. Tikku, if I could ask you about the treatment protocols, what Mr. Gurjeet Sekhon was asking, and in fact, there's a related question from Maya Meechandani, which is that why is there such a vast difference in the treatment protocols in India compared to, say, the US or Europe, particularly on the issue of antivirals, plasma therapy, ivermectin, etc. We have another question also on ivermectin, that is it necessary? So the protocols are differing from country to country. How does one explain that?
Well, there is anecdotal evidence regarding most of these drugs. And regarding antivirals specifically, they do have a role, but it's the timing which is very important. When are you giving it? Initially, to mild patients who are under home isolation, you can give antiviral drugs like favipiravir. We've been using it for more than a year now. And in my experience, it does work when it's given in the first 24 to 48 hours. After that, it doesn't have a role. Antivirals reduce the viral load. They inhibit the viral replication. Once you're beyond 5-6 days, then it has no role. And the problem here is by the time you actually get to know that you have COVID, it's already 5-6 days. For a couple of days, you'll think it's a viral disease. Then you will take paracetamol. Then someone will tell you get the test done. Then you're not getting the right lab or whatever. Then you get an appointment. It's already 5 days down. Then there is no role for antivirals after that. So timing is very, having said that, it's not a knockout drug. There is not enough evidence about them, but they do have a role. It's a virus, and antivirals do have a role. Now, everyone is taking doxycycline, azithromycin. These are antibiotics. Now, do they have a role? Do antibiotics have a role in a viral disease? Not at all. But they do some immune modulation. That's why they're being used. Again, ivermectin, not enough evidence, anecdotal, being used in India, Bangladesh. It's not used in any other country. But there was some study in Australia. So right now we need more of data on these drugs, but something is better than nothing. What do you do otherwise? I'm sure in US and UK, they don't give you anything besides paracetamol in the first 1 week. At least we are trying something. Regarding remdesivir, again, the timings, there's not enough data on that drug. In fact, the largest trial which happened in US says that it doesn't prevent mortality. It just reduces hospital stay by a few days, 1 or 2 days. And again, the timing is very important. You can't give it after 10 days. Everyone is rushing, buying it in the gray market for lakhs of rupees. But the fact of the matter is that it's useless after a while. Even in the second stage, beyond a week, it has its own limitations. It can't be given to everyone. It has to be used judiciously. So they do have a role, though limited, but we can't say they're totally useless.
So
There is nothing else.
trial and error, because this is a new virus. And
Yeah.
I have a related question, Dr. Tikku, which I'd like all of you to actually tackle. You can tackle it first, which is that also I see a lot of people are self-medicating. You open a family WhatsApp group and everybody has a piece of advice for you, and they're also self-medicating with steroids, which I'm not a doctor, but sounds damn scary. You shouldn't be doing that, I guess. And in COVID, isn't it true that that can actually have the reverse impact? If you take steroids too early, you're actually harming yourself rather than helping yourself.
Yeah, exactly. That's the most horrible thing that can happen. A lot of patients are taking steroids from day one. They've been prescribed it. Some family friends said it. Some friends said it who had COVID. Because steroids are very potent anti-inflammatory drugs, they reduce your fever right there within 12 hours. So they think that the drug is working, but that's not the indication. In the first 1 week, especially in the first 5 days, you're not supposed to take steroids. They increase the viral load. They increase the viral replication. Initially, they might bring the fever down. You get some symptomatic relief, but after 5 to 7 days, suddenly you'll have a fulminant pneumonia. I've seen a lot of patients who were taking steroids from day one, landing in trouble, landing in the hospital, and they have a very bad disease. So initially, in the first 1 week, it's all about symptomatic treatment and maybe some antiviral drug early on in the disease. Okay, fine, you can take ivermectin, doxycycline. They are in our guidelines. They won't harm you. But steroids, definitely a big no. And a lot of people have been taking steroids and landing in trouble. And some of them have diabetes, and then their sugars shoot up, secondary infections happen. So the, steroids have a role later on after 5 to 6 days. If you have persistent fever, bad bouts of cough, blood in sputum, your inflammatory markers in the blood are high, CRP is pretty high, you get in touch with your doctors, do a scan. Scan is showing a pneumonia, whether it's mild, moderate, severe, that your doctor has to decide whether you can be treated at home with steroids, without steroids, whether you need hospitalization. So it all has to be done under medical supervision. You should not take any drug except vitamins on your own. And all these things, which they think works like vitamins and antibiotics, they actually might not be doing anything. So
Right.
you go with the expert advice. Don't listen to what people tell you. Now,
Absolutely.
people don't have the concept of family physicians also. That's another problem.
Yeah.
Some people have no physician. They just ask any family doctor, whether it's a gynecologist, orthopedician, he tells them, take this, take that. I mean, you need to have one physician attached to your family who guides you. I mean, most of the times they think it's some virus. We thought it's a viral disease. We didn't get tested. Come on. Everyone has COVID right now. Whoever has fever has COVID, unless proven otherwise. And that's another problem that we are facing. They're not getting the right advice because they don't ask the right people.
Very, very important. Do not self-medicate, particularly with steroids. So I hope people out there are listening to that. Shivam Patel also has an important question. While we get Shivam Patel onto the panel, Dr. Rao, you wanted to make a comment. I saw your hand was raised. Please.
See, what I wanted to add to what Dr. Tikku said was that absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. Now, currently, we are at a stage of pandemic when we don't have full answers. And naturally, if you look at the stress and strain on the medical healthcare system, we are doing our best to see what we can do. Now, naturally, globally, and we are all connected globally now, it's not that India is isolated. We are talking to all the global leaders to understand what guidelines, but there are contradicting reports, and that's difficult for us. But at that time, it is the judicial reasoning of the doctor to decide how to best treat the patient to save his life. And I think that's what a lot of people on ground are doing, whether it is remdesivir or plasma, to look at to see whether we can logically look at the best evidence at the current time and do the best we can. And naturally, this is going to evolve in the next few days or months. It's a moving target for us now.
Dr. Jameel, there's an interesting question here before I come to Shivam Patel, which is that, how do we also overcome these concerns that, we have about a combination of vaccine hesitancy on one hand, privacy on the other, and also the need for mass vaccination? I mean, do we need to make vaccination mandatory in order for things to really come back to normal in the country? That's going to be so important, for instance, for institutions, schools, colleges to reopen and function properly. How do we balance all these concerns?
Well, I really don't subscribe to the view that vaccination should be mandatory. And the reason simply is that all of these are vaccines that are under emergency use approval. These are not vaccines that have been tested for a very long period of time. So let's say the state makes vaccination mandatory. And let's say somebody has vaccine-related injury. Would the state compensate? So there are all sorts of new questions that come up when you talk about making it mandatory. But there is also sufficient evidence that vaccines are the most cost-efficient public health tools. For every dollar that you invest in vaccines, there is a return of $44 on that investment. This is from a public health point of view, and we are seeing in a pandemic situation as well. Let's say you take a vaccine and it reduces your chance of getting into a hospital. You may get infected, but your chance of getting into a hospital by 80%. Look at the cost saving. Look at the saving for everyone, including the healthcare system. So don't make it mandatory, but I think it's important for people to understand that, what vaccines can do and what vaccines cannot do. With that caveat, there are two good vaccines available. Currently, there is a shortage of supply of vaccines, but that will be corrected. Whatever is available to you, please go and get it, because it might just save your life. I mean, I see this happening all the time. People are writing all the time, should I take this vaccine or should I take that vaccine? When is the Pfizer vaccine coming to India? I mean, you have two good vaccines here. I mean, and people are still waiting for the Pfizer vaccine to come to India. I mean, that doesn't really make sense. That doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. Take what
So
you
just
get.
go ahead and get whatever is available. Be a good citizen, be good to yourself, be good to others. Please go get a vaccine. And after you get a vaccine, please keep wearing your mask.
Shivam Patel, is Shivam Patel here?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
You can go ahead, please.
Good morning to everyone. Sir, I have a question. From the very beginning, medical experts have asked government to focus on proper genome sequencing of around 5% tests that are being conducted. But still we are not doing 1% of it. Is this due to lack of resources? Will this lead to the another wave?
Okay, and in fact, genome sequencing, Dr. Tiku, you had raised that issue right at the beginning. I think the question Shivam has is that, I mean, are we putting ourselves at risks for an even worse third wave if we don't do this?
We have to do it proactively. We have to do it because genome sequencing is very, very important. UK does it in a big way, and we have to follow the mutant strains and we have to track their characters. We need to know whether the virus is becoming more virulent, whether it's more infectious. That's how we'll take precautions, and that's how new drugs and vaccine will be developed. So we really need to do this very, very aggressively. The need of the hour is to get into genome sequencing in a big way. We learned it the hard way. We're facing the brunt now of these mutant strains, and I'm sure the government is looking at it, and we will do it now onwards before the third wave hits us.
Before I go on to the next set of questions, a quick question.
Nidhi, can I just add a word on
Yeah.
genome sequencing?
Yes, Dr.
The government has put together a program. It's called INSACOG, Indian SARS Consortium on Genomics, which is a grouping of 10 different national laboratories that have come together to do genome sequencing. And in the last 6 weeks, about 20,000 sequences have been done from across the country. And based on that, we know that there are two variants of concern in India that are spreading quite well. One is something called the Indian variant, or also called the double mutant. The actual number for that is B1617. And the other is the UK variant. And we are also beginning to see now that the Indian variant is sort of out-competing the UK variant in the population. But as Dr. Tiku rightly said, you do genome sequencing for two reasons. One is to find out what is in the population, but more importantly, to find out what is emerging and what might be in the population tomorrow. And for that, you need fairly high density sequencing. You must be sequencing, roughly 5% of your cases. But remember, 5% of cases today, 4 lakh cases a day, is huge. That's beyond the capacity, the total capacity of genome sequencing in the country. But nevertheless, there is this consortium that is sequencing, and that is beginning to provide some of the answers that we are seeking.
I see an interesting question here again, one that is often asked this is from Trilok Bhaskar Kothapalli. Dr. Rao, if you could answer this question, that we're seeing a huge demand for plasma. Firstly, my sort of addition to this question is, does plasma therapy really work? I mean, anecdotally, one hears of a few cases where the patient has felt better, but what is the truth about plasma therapy? And what Mr. Trilok is asking is, there are a lot of rumors that donating plasma will reduce antibodies and increase the risk of getting COVID again. So what is the truth to this, Dr. Rao?
So during the first pandemic, we actually set out at HCG to set up the first phase 1 bar 2 protocol, for which the DCGI gave us approval. And we were in touch that time, collaborating with Elsevier's, the Lancet Resource Center, and our hematology team, the blood bank team set up, and we did close to 1,400 plasmas during the first wave. Now, and we also collaborated with Indian Institute of Science to actually understand this better. From our current understanding, there are absolutely divided opinions. One thing that we know, at least from the ICMR studies, if you give plasma without checking antibodies, it is absolutely useless. That is very clear. The second thing that we know is, if you give it after 72 hours, its efficacy is doubtful. So there are two important messages that one is within 72 hours of oxygen requirement. Second is high antibody titers. And we are in touch with the Mayo Clinic, the WHO team, and several others to understand. What we gather is, currently, again, this is always plasma is used as a makeshift arrangement until you have some tangible arrangements ready. Now, at this juncture, we do not have a treatment for COVID whatsoever. But these are the ones that we are used until we kind of make makeshift arrangements. It's taking longer. So plasma is still something that is being advocated in a very, very limited area. And this is within 72 hours of oxygen requirement in people with high antibody titers. This may play a role, but final verdict is not yet out. Currently, Mayo Clinic has got authorization from the US FDA under emergency use. But beyond that, we are not strongly kind of advocating it to kind of market it to say that like remdesivir, you should create a black market for it. But yes, in selected cases, the physician advises it. We are keeping it, and we are still running the plasma bank. And we have our state plasma committee. We constantly are in touch with global bodies. So that's what I would like to say.
Okay, Dr. Tikku, just a quick question here about, again, coming back to the issue of vaccination. Those people who do now have had COVID, how long are they actually protected? Again, one reads very conflicting reports in the international media also about how long your antibodies actually last. Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? I've seen so many people who got reinfected with COVID this time who had the infection 6 months ago. So I'm presuming that's probably the outer limit at the moment. So one is, how long does the protection from the reinfection last? And when should one who has recovered from COVID, when should they get vaccinated? What is the right gap?
Well, how long an immunity lasts, nobody actually knows. We don't have enough data on that, but it's supposed to be 3 to 6 months. And you can always check your antibodies, but immunity is not only based on antibodies. There's T-cell mediated immunity also. And it sort of gives you some protection even if you don't have antibodies. It's not that you keep getting the infection again and again. But having said that, there are reinfections happening, and they're probably happening because of the mutant strains. So your antibodies might not be working against a particular strain, especially these mutant strains which we were talking about. And so that's why one has to be very, very careful. That's why we say even after you've had an infection, you should keep maintaining COVID appropriate behavior, wear a mask. So it's a must. You can get reinfected, though it's not very, very common. Earlier, we had not seen it, but in this way, we are seeing enough reinfections. Coming to your second question, when you should get inoculated post-infection, I would say at least 3 months. You have to give it because that's the kind of protection you usually get around 3 months. There is some data which says at least 3 months. So during those 3 months also, you have to make sure that you wear a mask, you maintain social distancing and blah, blah. You have to do all that. But at least 3 months gap, that's what I would suggest.
Okay, at least 3 months gap.
Yeah.
I want to come to, the one issue we haven't yet talked about in so much detail, which Dr. Tikku did talk about a little earlier, which was the complete collapse of our healthcare infrastructure, our systems. The fact is, Dr. Jamil, that even today, the national capital, you're struggling to find hospital beds. I was just saying before we came online that I was trying to help a close friend of mine get her mother to a hospital, and the hospital just they turned around and said, we don't have an ICU bed, her oxygen is dipping. So she's finally found a bed in Haryana somewhere 2 hours away. What happened? I mean, how did we take our eye off the ball so badly? Dr. Jamil, first I'll ask you, and what are the lessons, more importantly, that we need to learn, that the government needs to learn from this mess that has been created currently, so that this doesn't happen again? What do they need to do?
Well, Nidhi, it did not take a rocket scientist to really understand that there would be a second wave. Yes, I do agree that nobody anticipated such a big second wave. But every country in the world that had COVID before us, had the first wave before us, had a second wave. And in January, February, and March, we had our leaders telling us that India has conquered COVID. Indians are special. This is the end game of COVID. And I'm using all the phrases that some of our tallest leaders have used. That led to complacency. If you went around Delhi's markets in January and February, you'd hardly find people wearing masks. There were large weddings, and hardly anyone wore a mask at these weddings. And then you had local body elections, you had state elections, you had the Kumbh Mela. Every super spreader event that you can possibly think of happened. What we did not know at that point is that variant viruses were sort of developing and simmering under this layer. And this broke loose towards the end of February. That's when the numbers started going up. So we actually created a situation for ourselves where we had enough susceptible people, and those susceptible people were not protecting themselves. That is one. The second is that more infectious mutants developed. So this whole narrative that this surge is because of mutants is not the entire truth. This surge is because of complacency, which was exploited by mutants. And that is something we need to understand. And if we don't understand this now, we will get into a third wave and face the same problems. So viruses behave like this. Viruses, respiratory viruses, always come in waves. Yet we were being told that we are somehow special because Indians get BCG vaccination as children, because Indians have malaria and use hydroxychloroquine. You know, because of all of these things, we get so many infections, so we are protected from this one. No, Indians are not special. I'm sorry, it breaks the heart of a few people, but Indians are not special. Indians are just as vulnerable, as wise, or as stupid as everyone else in the world. So let's not think of ourselves as special. From a perspective of a virus, from a perspective of a disease, we are as vulnerable as anyone else. The day we understand it and the day we start protecting ourselves, we should be fine.
I want to ask both Dr. Rao and Dr. Tikku about, as you know, as what do you need as medical professionals, as frontline healthcare workers today? What is it that you would want to appeal to the government? Because look, we can sit here and we need to fix accountability for this. I have been writing about that myself, but we also need to look at solutions and how we can get out of this crisis at the moment. So Dr. Rao, let me come to you first. If you had to make an appeal as a doctor, what to the government, what would it be so that we do not face this level of crisis again?
So I think to add to a lot of points what Dr. Jamil has already covered, I think very, very broadly, very clearly, he has covered the part of complacency, that we let our guards down. And I would add to the point to say that we even went to the extent last year to say that Karnataka is different from Maharashtra. Maharashtra is different because we eat pani puri to these people have better immunity to, we saying Delhi and Kerala are different. We went to that chaos when we actually had one common denominator of the virus. So the assumptions that we did led us to have our guards down, which led to the second wave. And this was added by the what I call the statistical pandemic. The statistical pandemic gave us wrong statistics. So they kept giving us reassuring statistics to say, don't worry. So you see, you had a statistician telling you that, look, we have already achieved herd immunity, don't worry. To somebody telling you, look, our Indian immune system is different. So there was a lot of misconception. So I often say, along with the loss of sense of smell, we lost common sense. And as what Dr. Jamil was saying, so we lost a lot of that. And that led to this kind of a confusion where there are countries that have centers for pandemic preparedness. Here, we do not have such kind of trained man. We need to start investing in health seriously. Whether it's GDP, whether it's R&D, whether it is pandemic preparedness, we have to learn these lessons to say that we need to be better ready. One. Second, our behavioral adaptation of laws. I think it's very, very important to understand that we behaviorally did not adopt laws. We kept, again, when you look at places like Japan or places like Germany or other places, there was absolute compliance with the law, and which is where people said they definitely educated, the uneducated and the enlightened ones. All three have lost their guards, and that I think was across the board. I kept mentioning this in a lot of our talks to say that every socio-economic zone has to be run like an OPD, has to be run like an hospital. Every socio-economic zone means, is it a house, an apartment, or is it going to be an economic zone of a shop or an industry? It needs to be run like a hospital. Wear your mask, wear your hand hygiene. And to add to the point of what Dr. Tikku said earlier, when you stay at home and how do you get infected? Ventilation is the key. Well ventilated places, because this virus lingers around in areas when there's no ventilation. So we've been re-emphasizing that more than fomites. Talk about ventilation. We've overemphasized on fomites, don't touch this, don't touch that. More than that, talk about ventilation. That's a crucial area where we need to do. So bottom line is beds, oxygen, manpower. I think we do not have all the three, like all the panelists have told earlier. The only way to cut down this virus is to maintain your mask. And I think I would like to again add to what Dr. Jamil said. The first thing is wear your mask. Second thing is vaccinate yourself. That's an option you have. And that's the two guards you have right now to stop the pandemic. The virus does not have hands and legs. It's you who are moving the virus. And that's the only way we can stop this pandemic. And the healthcare burden is already overburdened. This war cannot be won in the hospital. It has to be won at home.
But Dr. Tikku, you are at the heart right now in Delhi, and Karnataka also, Dr. Rao is really particularly bad right now. But in Delhi, Dr. Tikku, you have witnessed firsthand the complete collapse in the national capital, where oxygen, is running out in, big hospitals. They're literally coming on Twitter and posting SOS messages. I mean, this is unlike anything one has seen. And for a country that aspires to be a superpower, it is astounding that this happens. One of the things that happened in Delhi was that we had that big 1,000-bed, I think, DRDO facility, which was there. And then we just packed it up in February thinking that COVID is over. Now, is that what you think Delhi needs right now? There's a debate right now that should the military get involved? Do we need to bring the army in, get them to set up makeshift hospitals because they can do it? Do you think that we've come to that point where we need to think out of the box, use stadiums as hospitals, get the army involved, and just, put all our resources there, because this is a war. It's just a different kind of war.
Well, actually, yes, I think so. It's like a war out there, and you need to have these makeshift hospitals, field hospitals, emergency beds, and that's how we can win this war. I mean, the need of the hour is to make makeshift beds, ventilators, drugs available right now. That's what is going to help us today. Vaccination benefits will come a few months later. That has to happen in parallel. But vaccination is not going to help us now. Today, our problem is the beds, hospital beds, and oxygen. And that's what somebody has to coordinate. As I said earlier, somebody has to coordinate that and has to make sure, collaborate with the governments of different countries, with our own health ministry, with WHO, and make it happen for us. Right now, we need all these supplies, drugs, hospital beds. That's what we need. And if we need to have a complete lockdown, why not? In certain areas where there is high positivity, I would say go for it. It's not going to be endless. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. It will definitely bring down the rate of transmission of infection. So, and yes, army can help us in doing all this. Along with the lockdown, plus the fact that the way it's spreading right now, the entire system will totally collapse. I mean, it's still functional. So we have to work on all this. We have to work on all this. And again, with the vaccination, bring in more vaccines. We can't have just 1 and 2 vaccines. We are relying on the vaccine, banking on it. But what is the population? 1.3 billion people. And how many have we vaccinated till now? 16 crores. And how many have had 2 vaccines? Less than 2%. So it's going to take us 2 years. And with 2 vaccines, you need to have more. Yes, after due diligence, going through the data. So we have to do all this. Right now, it's like a war out there, and army, whatever it takes.
Right. I have a question because we just have the last 5 minutes left. Ritika has asked Dr. Tikku, if you could take this first. Do we need, any tests that have to be done or any medication that should be taken after you recover from COVID? And I have an extension of that. One is reading a lot about cardiac issues, post-recovery, going slow on exercise. What would you advise those who have recovered from COVID? How long should they wait before they resume physical activity? Let's say they did moderate to heavy physical activity, they went to the gym, or how long should they wait? Do you advise people to get cardiac tests done as well after a certain point of time, just to check on their heart?
See, not everyone needs a cardiac check post getting COVID, but if you're vulnerable, if you're 60 and above, if you're diabetic, so if you had a cardiac history in the past, yes, you might as well, especially before you start doing exercise and all. I would not recommend any strenuous activity for at least 2 to 3 months post you had COVID, young or old, whatsoever, because we've had certain deaths happening in young people post COVID when they were exercising. It triggers some cardiac event or stroke or whatever. So we have some evidence regarding that. So no need to hit the gym or do strenuous exercises at home. So one has to go gradual about it. And Coming to tests, I don't think everyone needs to do all the tests all the time. I mean, once you recovered, if your D-dimer or something, your CRP was very high, you recovered, there's some discrepancy between your clinical status and the reports. Yes, maybe you'll have to repeat, or maybe a general check after 2 to 4 weeks. But I would leave it to the physician. There's no hard and fast in this, that everyone has to do certain tests. Everyone has to do a cardiac check, echo, ECG. Everyone has to repeat a CT scan. No, a lot of people are doing all that. It is not required. And in fact, the ones who are getting COVID are getting a CT done within the first 5 days when it's not going to show anything. They come with the CT report and then they have a false sense of security that our CT is normal. We don't have a lung involvement. And actually, when they have it, they're not aware of it. So don't overdo things. Go with the I would still say go with the medical advice. Everyone doesn't need all the tests. Your doctor will decide what you need.
And I have a quick second question on the vaccination again to you, which is that you said that people should wait about 3 months after recovering from COVID to get their vaccine. But what if you had already got one dose and then you got infected? When should you get your second dose? Also after 3 months of recovery?
Yeah, at least a month later.
A
Ideally
month.
3 months, yeah. But immediately post-COVID, I wouldn't recommend.
So
getting
a
the
3-month
vaccination.
gap, even after having had one dose and getting COVID, is you would still recommend that?
I would still recommend that because there's a lot of evidence now which says that if you had COVID and you had one shot, probably you don't need the second one. But I don't recommend that. I would still ask you to finish your vaccination schedule and maybe 1-2 months later, because you've had one shot and then you had COVID, immediately doesn't make sense. Maybe 2 months, 3 months gap.
Dr. Rao, last question to you. I'm getting a lot of people asking about, when is the right time to donate plasma? And can you donate plasma how long after recovery from COVID, A? And if you've been vaccinated even with one dose, can you donate plasma?
Yeah, so I think, so I missed out the first question earlier. When you donate plasma, your antibodies, you do not reduce your immune system. Second thing is you ideally donate plasma when your IgG antibodies are high. And we are using the Vitros assay here to map that. So it should be at least 6 times higher to call it high antibodies. Now you do that when you are completed 1 month post recovery within 3 months. The second aspect is that if you have taken a vaccine, yes, you can donate plasma if you have got not just a vaccine, but infection and vaccine together.
Okay, as in around the same time or one after the other?
After 1 month. So whatever said and done, the infection period is deciding whether you should give plasma or not. So 1 month after your infection, when your antibodies are high, we really recheck your antibodies. And at that juncture, if your IgG antibody levels are very high, that is when we decide that you can give plasma or not.
All right. Well, I really have to leave it at that. We're right at the end of this discussion, but thank you very much to all of you, Dr. Jameel, Dr. Rao, Dr. Tikku, for joining us and answering so many questions. I know there were so many more that couldn't get answered, but these are by and large the number of questions that people had on dealing with the second wave of COVID. All of you have also given important constructive suggestions to the government, to the powers that be on what we need to do going ahead. And I do hope that they're listening to that. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you.